possibly the only Irish person ever. And the other thing is, it's of course lovely to see, you know, all the people that I've met before, including, and this will embarrass him, Seamus, who I think was in the first year of LLMs I ever taught. So that's nice as well. So it's really lovely. Thank you for having me. Now, when I first agreed to give this talk, I had a plan, and I was going to have 6 glorious weeks after my return from maternity leave, and I was going to present you with a dazzling, near complete piece of research, right? I took an extra month of research leave, right? Which means that I've had a week of answering a lot of emails and desperately trying to think about this paper, okay? So what this means is not just that I am a disorganized mess, it also means that the paper is at a stage where it's really evolving, right? So, and I am shamelessly going to exploit the fact that this is a staff seminar and not a lecture. And I want feedback and I want thoughts. If you think something is great, I adore praise like everyone else. If you think something is really problematic, it's also very important to hear. So I really would, while I'd welcome questions, I would also welcome comments and suggestions. The paper, just to give a tiny bit of background, the paper that I am presenting, or the draft paper, has developed from 2 separate long-term research interests of mine, right? The first is the link between human development and human rights, and particularly development and economic and social rights. And it's not a coincidence, of course, that many of the people who look at development from a human rights lens tend to use an economic and social rights lens. I mean, there are clear areas of interest: housing, education, social policy, etc., etc. The second area is that research focus that has led to this paper is a long-term interest on child poverty and child rights and the connections. And also in recent years, I've been looking extensively at the way in which child rights are used by policymakers, who are generally not lawyers, in work around poverty amelioration or poverty eradication. Okay? And a lot of those actors, think UNICEF, think those working on child-related issues in UNDP, those working in overseas development and assistance agencies at the state level, a lot of those organisations are now focusing on the SDGs as a new framework. And they're interested in child rights, but the SDGs is very much the hot topic, and I'll come back to that point at the moment. So, to start with it. But so where were we, right? So many of you will have heard, you know, anyone who did a course on human rights and development up until about 2013 will have heard at great length about the disconnects between human rights and development, right? So we have disconnections in terms of the mandates of the different processes. Human rights are very clearly framed in terms of human rights law standards. Development, much more nebulous. Yes, the MDGs were important, but in fact there are multiple different frameworks and approaches in particular to development work. They have different aims. I mean, overlapping aims for sure, but you have a situation in which one is the achievement of rights and one is the achievement of development conceptualized in a particular way, right? There's differences in terms of disciplines, approaches, and methodology, right? Child rights, human rights, absolutely dominated by lawyers, less so in recent years, but the reason for that, we all know, is because of the strongly legal nature, historically, of the human rights project. Okay? Development, absolutely not dominated by lawyers. You know, the economists, the development specialists, the political scientists, the social policy people, right? So very different approaches, very different outlooks, different values, different aims of these groups of people. And it's one of the reasons why the conversations between law and development have often, even when it's friendly audiences, have been very challenging. And there's a very good example that I was given by the then independent expert on extreme poverty and human rights, Magdalena Sepulveda, which I know she wouldn't mind my sharing, where when she was doing work around the guiding principles on extreme poverty, which was very much bringing the development people to the table and the human rights people to the table, it was actually in some ways very frustrating and problematic. And it took much longer to get people working on the same page than was expected, because even though these were people who were fundamentally interested in the same thing, they had different language, different tools, different methodologies, and it was, you know, it was a complex engagement. And finally, obviously, very different institutional arrangements, okay? If we think about who advanced development historically, it certainly wasn't the UN treaty bodies, it certainly wasn't, I'm giving the international level, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, okay? So very different. And certainly there's this excellent, I think it's a very useful summarising quote by Siobhan McInerney Langford, who is involved in has done a huge amount of human rights focused work at the World Bank. So it was really at the absolute kind of ground zero of some of these discussions, highlighting that the relationship between human rights and development is more defined by its distinctions and disconnects than by its points of convergence, right? These were two ships passing in the night, which is the analogy I think Philip Alston used as it in the collection that he and Mary Robinson did a few years ago, and it's an excellent one. So then, 2015, we have the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, right? It's marvellous, champagne corks are popped, we are thrilled. And truthfully, human rights people were thrilled, right? I remember someone who at the time was a UN Special Rapporteur and turned around and said, when we heard the speeches that states were saying as they, around the final adoption of the 2030 Agenda, she said it was stunning. It was like we'd written them for them, all this language of economic and social rights, language that we'd have given our eye teeth to see. We were now hearing. As we moved towards this adoption of this framework in 2015, it was a heady euphoric atmosphere, particularly given that there had been real resistance at certain stages in the process to any inclusion of human rights, right? So the SDG, to be very clear, because a lot of what I say now afterwards will be negative, but actually there are real wins from a human rights perspective in the 2030 Agenda, right? It is miles beyond the MDGs. It is miles beyond the somewhat limited efforts that we had seen, particularly at the international level, with regards to human rights-based approaches to development, okay? So, each was good news. And what do we see? So I give you a couple of quotes, and they give you a sense of the extent to which human rights are included. The new agenda is guided by the purpose and principles of the Charter, including full respect for international law. It's grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then crucially, and this is very much linked with what I want to talk about today, the agenda is to be implemented in a manner that is consistent with the rights and obligations of the state under international law, right? So clearly international human rights law, right? Very exciting. I've done a little bit of counting using Control F. There's extensive reference to human rights, 18 mentions. It's not that long a document. That is, it is exciting. So we were thrilled, but we were suspicious. And it turns out, surprise, surprise, that there may have been calls for that. But there was certainly a feeling on the part of academics working in the area, advocates working in the area from a human rights perspective, that this was a framework that was definitely more progressive in terms of bringing human rights to bear in development than what had preceded it, okay? So, but are we, is it a brave new dawn or is it Groundhog Day, right? Because we still have, if we look at prevailing development discourses, even around the SDGs, we still have this gap in aims. I'll come back to the issue around content, okay? In some ways it's good. For instance, Sustainable Development Goal 4 in education talks about, lifelong learning, which is not included, certainly expressly, under the right to education under international human rights law, right? So in some ways, the SDGs move beyond. In other ways, they absolutely didn't, and I'll come back to those points, come back to that issue later. Very importantly, right? This is a huge issue. When we think about human rights law, and I'm oversimplifying, but it is true to say that it is still very much a state-centric system, right? Yes, we have seen the guiding principles on business and human rights. Yes, we have seen General Comment number 24 of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, okay? Yes, we have seen General Comment 16 on business and children's rights by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, right? And I can see people who don't work in the area blanking this, but I'm merely saying that yes, there has been progress, okay? But the fact is that it remains a state-centric system, and it's crucially, its accountability mechanisms are very, very state-oriented, right? And that is very different. That state orientation, the obligation, the focus on the state, is very different to what we see in the Sustainable Development Goals and in development itself, where very much the emphasis since the MDGs has been very much upon harnessing the resources of the private sector, of business, of non-state actors to advance development. Okay? And in theory, that's not necessarily troubling if it advances human rights enjoyment. It's simply that human rights don't deal with non-state actors very well. Okay, and I'll come back to that point as well. We have the issue of the monitoring mechanisms. Okay, so I'll talk a bit more about this process in a minute, but at the global level, we have the United Nations High-Level Political Forum that is the key global body for the monitoring and the reviewing of progress on state implementation of the SDGs, right? And at the international level, we have treaty bodies for human rights. Okay, so we have two different systems. They're not joined up, and they have separate mandates and separate roles. And crucially, one of the things you see that really impacts, it is clear that it really impacts on the impact on the human rights SDG disconnect in practice, is that the HLPF happens in New York, and the crucial human rights work of the UN happens in Geneva. And there has been literally an expression that geographical distance is also reflected in the distance, in the fact that you don't see integration between the relevant monitoring mechanisms or implementation mechanisms. Okay, we have different timelines. Human rights, we can talk till the cows come home. There's immediate obligations, and there's progressive obligations that have to be realised over time. Okay, that is very different to the kind of 2030 deadline and other sub-deadlines conceptualised under the SDGs. Okay? And there's arguments for and against each, in terms of the definition of those deadlines. The benchmarks for each are very different. If you see a human rights-based indicator, it's likely to be quite different to an SDG-based indicator. And again, I'll come back to that. And finally, and crucially, right, we still have a situation where, enthusiastic as I might be about the SDGs, and there's fabulous stuff in there, but they remain policy goals, subject to effectively voluntary state compliance. And sure, there's an implementation gap with human rights, but the fact is that it is accepted that human rights impose legally binding obligations, right? And that is a massive gap, and there's a huge conceptual gap, and it feeds in not just into a kind of an aim lawyer, what is law, what is development, but actually the whole way in which the implementation processes, the monitoring processes, the review processes are conceptualized in the areas of development and human rights, which can be quite different. So I suppose what I'm saying is, yes, the SDGs are a step forward, but we still have these disconnects. Okay, so. Why do I have that? Yes, I've done that. Sorry, I hope that you did see that slide, but I'm now completely confused. Okay, so anyway, but I have focused on child rights. So why am I doing child rights? Now, it's not on the slide, but basically human rights is huge, and you've got to pick. You can hope to, it's too big a project. Overall, I'm very interested in it, but I think child rights is very useful for a range of reasons, right? First of all, there's a massive focus on children and the challenges they face in Agenda 2030, right? There's extensive references to children, to girl children in particular, to youth, which includes older children. They're there front and centre, okay? In the 2030 agenda in the 2030 agenda. The other thing is you have some really strong overlap in content between the SDGs and child rights, okay? And you can see in this hideous slide, right, where you can see I've crammed far too much information for myself rather than for yourselves. You can see an enormous, the right to education. There's a very big overlap between the right to education under international human rights law and SDG 4 on the SDG 4, which is focused again on education. You have the rights to food and health, which coincide with the SDGs particularly around poverty, around health, and I have now pulled a blank, so I will quickly check what number 3 is. And I will come back to this, sorry, my brain is just frozen. Non-discrimination, equality in girls, and the SDGs again. You've got a specific SDG on gender equality with a huge focus on girls. And then finally, you've the right, because I said already, economic and social rights have historically been the focus of rights and development work. But actually, then let's look at SDG 16. And we see a huge emphasis on rights to protection from abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence. Okay, so very squarely in the civil and political rights, front and center. Okay. The other thing is the children's sector, including the child rights sector, but the anti-child poverty sector, really welcomed the SDGs. Okay, there was a real sense that this was an opportunity to push forward efforts to combat child poverty. Okay, this was a sector that was relatively comfortable with it, didn't regard as particularly intimidating, and indeed a child rights-based approach is something that to various policy and law processes is something that the child sector has done in great detail, even prior to 2015. And finally, the other reason that I think it's appropriate to look at the CRC is because it is unlike other human rights, international human rights treaties, only one state hasn't ratified the CRC, right? It has effectively universal sign-up, right? Apart from the States, which is has its own thing going on. But that is, none of the other treaties do it, so it makes sense. It's quite legitimate to think of it as effectively almost a universal framework, universally applicable framework in the way that the 2030 agenda is. So, on the one hand, this is all very good. You would think, when you think about child rights, well, it's fairly straightforward. The committee has either spoken about development specifically, or it has given guidelines that you can then adapt to the development context, right? So the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which monitors the CRC, has made clear the standards that are required of states when they're implementing the CRC. And these requirements also apply to state efforts to implement the SDGs, right? Not because it's a legal document, but because the CRC imposes a wide range of substantive and procedural obligations that adapt well to the development context. So, for instance, there's a requirement that national strategies and programming of the SDGs need to be rooted in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Okay? We have to ensure, and again I'll come back to it, to make sure that non-state actors like business don't interfere with enjoyment of children's rights as a result of SDG-related activities. Best interests. It's a fundamental principle of international human rights law. The best interests of a child have to be a primary consideration in all matters or decisions or policies or strategies affecting them. The committee has said an awful lot about child rights impact assessment and child rights evaluation. Okay, and these are methodologies that can certainly be applied to the law, policy, or budgetary allocations related to SDG implementation. And finally, there's two more points that I just want to emphasize. First of all, there's, as many of you here will know, and I've simplified it on the slide, but there's been more and more work around the obligations of countries as members of international governmental organisations and involvement with international financial institutions. And the CRC has been quite explicit on this issue, so has the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, focusing on the scope of these obligations, the extent to which states cannot say, well, it's a decision of the IMF, or it's a decision of it's a decision of the EU, for instance, a regional body that I'm involved in. So I'm not, but I'm not chief of, so I'm not directly liable for it. There's been quite a huge amount of work, in this area. And that's very important because obviously when we think about sustainable development, and I've already mentioned it, but we've talked about this issue of non-state actors. But think about the World Bank. Right? There's a report by the World Bank is at best, I think, we could most kindly describe it as a fraught relationship with human rights. Paul Hunt and Philip Alston, with their right to health and extreme poverty and human rights mandates respectively, have done quite a bit of work focusing on the resistance of the World Bank and the IMF to human rights concepts, both in terms of evaluation of its actions, but also internalization in its own procedures, strategies, vision, etc. Okay? And that's a huge issue because those bodies, the World Bank in particular, has such a large role to play when it comes to giving effect to the SDGs, particularly with regards to less developed economies, right? And finally, in addition to this kind of delineation of obligation that the committee has been involved in, with regards to IGOs and international development assistance, we see that there has been explicit consideration of this notion of extraterritorial obligations. Article 4 of the CRC, like Article 2.1 of ISESCR, very clearly has an extraterritorial component. And there has been, unlike other areas of human rights where it's been quite a controversial area, given that to some degree it's envisaged by the CRC and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, there's actually been quite a lot of work done by the treaty bodies and by academics working in the area talking about the standards that apply when it comes to international development cooperation policies, right? And that will obviously apply to international development cooperation policies that relate to the SDG implementation processes as well, okay? So, basically, we have the tools. To some degree, we know what it is that child rights will require. So you would think, well, you know, we're grand, we're fine, we're there. But, and again, I apologise for the hideous slide, so I wouldn't even bother reading that one because it's clearly font 12 and I didn't notice. Sorry. So, why am I concerned, right? If you want the slides, I'm happy to circulate them later. First of all, yes, the SDGs are, as I said at the beginning, potentially very good for child rights, right? But actually, so far, despite what we've seen already, what I spoke about just now, there is very limited evidence that the implementation, monitoring and accountability processes that we associate with the SDGs are either being conceptualized, developed, or indeed implemented in line with child rights. Okay? There's a lot of loose talk about child rights, but actually if you look at the processes themselves and the outcomes of those processes, there seems to be very limited traction in practice. Second thing, the SDGs, like quite a lot of economic and social rights work, are very keen on the provision and protection rights of children, but they're not great on participation, right? And we all know that the MDGs were savagely and correctly criticised for their failure to incorporate an adequate participatory element. I mean, they were criticised for loads of stuff, but this was definitely one of the important things. But what's worrying is not just that obviously the child's right to participation rights under the CRC are very well known. You know, the child's right to express their views freely in all matters concerning them, which is under Article 12 of the CRC. But actually, it's not just about whether that right has been given effect to. It's about how children are viewed in the SDGs, right? So historically, we've had this huge issue around rights. You know, people arguing that actually we should use a rights framework, not a rights discourse rather than a development discourse, because actually we want to think about those affected by or who are meant to benefit from development as not as right holders but as beneficiaries, right? So not entitled to claim anything, but as, you know, kind of the lucky recipients of a benevolent government advancing a policy goal, okay? And that is particularly exacerbated and problematic, that approach, if we think about the challenges that children already face, you know, due to their legal, political, social exclusion and democratic exclusion, in terms of being considered to be active social agents, in terms of being considered as right holders, okay? And there is, and again I come back to this third issue, the third reason that I am concerned, and this underpins indeed, really underpins my concern, my interest in the project generally, is the fact that I feel that there is a real concern that states may embrace the language of SDGs rather than child rights, because it is a way of getting rid of the burdens of accountability, of obligation, that states don't really like, and they particularly don't like when it comes to economic and social rights, including those of children, right? And for me, one of the things that's been very interesting and is a significant concern is that the last 25 years, for instance, for economic and social rights scholars, has been about taking economic and social rights and making sure that they are moved from the development basket into the rights basket. Okay, that's been a huge part of the work of scholars, of advocates, and indeed of treaty bodies. Okay? However, my concern now, and there is evidence that would suggest that that is a legitimate concern, is that actually the SDGs and their language of rights is a way of states going, yes, well, I mean, obviously it's a rights issue, but it's an SDG issue too, and really it's better for us to deal with this, pressing, resource-dependent, politically controversial, we simply don't like it issue under the heading of development. We're not going to deal with it as a human rights issue. Okay, so it's a fear that we will see these issues being moved from the rights basket back to the development basket. And the reversal of progress and the conceptualization, not economic and social rights for their own sake, right? That's a legalistic, rather precious point. But actually the notion of economic and social rights right holders as having entitlements to rights that relate to their basic needs and need survival, development and flourishing, right? That's a big deal, right? To move back to this beneficiary model. The other thing that I am concerned about is by the inclusion of human rights in SDGs, and then sort of by their being a little bit sidelined, not being the key focus, I think that there's a real concern that actually rights will stop being a dominant part of the international political and legal discourse when it comes to areas like child protection, education, and child poverty, where they really have started to have had huge traction. Okay. And finally, and this, it sounds petty, but it's actually massively important when we think about the practice, the implementation of human rights, is that there is anecdotal and other evidence of clear evidence of the diversion of funding, whether it's from donors, whether it's from research councils, whether it's from NHR, whether it's from national human rights institutions, or international assistance and cooperation budgets, or other state budgets, away from rights frame projects to SDG frame projects. The SDG is a buzzword, and it is terribly hot. And all of a sudden we see these big philanthropic giver going, well, I've heard about these SDGs, they're really exciting, states like them, it's a language that clearly appeals to people who have not been keen on certain human rights issues before, so business, states, etc. So why don't you frame this in terms of SDGs? Why don't you focus on the SDG, implementation of processes rather than on the rights process, rights-related processes, or rights-related framing? And on one level, one can understand it because one thinks of it as being effective. And one could turn around and say, well, as long as it advances rights enjoyment, that's fine. But actually, there is a limit, I would say, to the extent to which it will advance rights enjoyment if it is based on a beneficiary model. If you lose this notion of rights as entitlement and as a framework that has to be adhered to, something that is obligatory rather than voluntary. And I think that's very concerning. If we think about how we conceptualize engagement or dealing with the lived experiences or the challenges faced by the most socially vulnerable and the poorest globally. Okay? So, now, I can see that all of you are like, yes, I feel we have now covered the human rights and development rant in some detail. So you'll be glad to know that I am now turning to what I'm actually going to be looking at. And this is where I would, absolutely welcome input, right? So first of all, what am I going to look at? So, I am focusing on SDG implementation, and for the moment I am focusing on the international, the HLPF, the UN High Level Political Forum. And the reason for that, frankly, is because it's the longest standing, it's the most established, and it is deeply influential, right? An awful lot. The indicators, for instance, that have been developed by the HL, that have been approved by the HLPF, the indicators for the realisation of the SDGs, will have an enormous impact in terms of framing regional and national indicators when it comes to realisation. And indicators is a big part of SDG implementation. You have your goals, your targets, and then you have these indicators where states provide data, or they provide information on these specific indicators. And they're not, of course, the indicators are not just reflective of state practice. States will respond to the indicators because they know what they're expected to report on and where progress should be. So first of all, we have fairly major issues with regards to exclusion of children from child rights from specific indicators. One of the particular areas is with regards to participation in decision making in the context of Goal 16. And Goal 16 is very much on, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. But there's a huge issue because certainly the draft indicators, certainly at the beginning, all reflected participation of adults. Right? They were focusing on engagement with institutions that were adult only. How many people engage with such and such, how many people do such and such. But they weren't institutions that children would ever engage with. And that's highly problematic because children literally weren't being counted. Even though within the 2030 agenda, amongst the Sustainable Development Goals, is probably the Sustainable Development Goal that most facilitates child participation. Is potentially a springboard for that. So that's an example of where you had a clear failure to even acknowledge the importance of children for the purposes of SDG implementation. And that's a huge issue from a child rights perspective because unlike other groups, as I said, children have this Article 12 right, this right to express their views, a participation right. It's a key element of child rights. Right? It's one of the 4 general principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And if you don't give effect to it, throughout the processes you do not have a child rights compliant system. Right? So there's clear issues around the implementation of the SDGs then from a child participation perspective if you look at the indicators. Financing. Okay, now financing for the SDGs at the international level, the big discussion has been on this financing for development, the Addis Ababa agenda. And the fact is, and I am not standing here, shrieking that we need to renationalise the railways, though I wouldn't mind it because frankly my local commute train is appalling, but that is a joke. I am not sitting here saying we need to take to the streets and abolish all private property, right? That's not my aim. However, there is a huge issue when you look at the SDGs, but particularly the financing for development, the Addis Ababa agenda, and its failure to engage in it, to pay more than lip service to the need to engage critically with the prevailing neoliberal economic paradigm that's a critical obstacle to child rights and indeed SDG, right? So there's real concern that in fact the financing and the implementation of the SDGs is going to fail to tackle entrenched economic inequality and other forms of inequality because it simply doesn't acknowledge it, because it's business as usual in terms of the existing policy ecosystem. Right? And this is, of course, against a background. We need to remember that the financial and economic crises of 2007 to 2008 were the first financial and economic crises in modern memory to not result in a major paradigm shift in terms of economic policy. Right? If anything, it retrenched the anti-big state individualist and I use neoliberal, and we can discuss the definition, but I very much borrow from Harvey's work in the definition, neoliberal economic model. Okay, so that's the background. And the SDGs certainly does not in any way suggest that there is going to be a transformation in conceptualizations of the generation of funds, the allocation of funds for the purposes of development. And CESR, who I cite on the slide, have done particularly excellent work around this. And there's also, if you're interested, the Sustainable Development Reports, which are by an NGO coalition, which again focus on different aspects of SDG implementation, but crucially engage with, where's the money going to come from? What will the system that gives rise to the money look like? Where will the money go? How will it happen? Right? So, for instance, I talk about the policy ecosystem and problems, but in fact, privatization is an enormous. The reliance on public-private partnerships is a huge element, and I'll talk about this more in a minute. But a huge element of a lot of prevailing development thinking, and it's strongly encouraged, I would say, in the 2030 Agenda document. So and this is obviously an issue as well, because we're very conscious of the the problems that we have seen in human rights terms that have been caused by privatization. You can look at the example of PFIs in this country, but obviously more broadly we see privatization having a very negative impact on education in certain African countries, for instance. So, the other thing I'm going to look at is, as I said, I'm going to focus on the HLPF on sustainable development. It's the key global monitoring and follow-up process. And as I say, it's a voluntary process, but states volunteer to provide voluntary national reviews where they assess where they kind of flag successes and challenges when it comes to giving effect to the SDGs. I won't get too involved in the process, but suffice to say they don't do all the SDGs at once. They do a certain number. They provide information. At the moment, I'm working with research assistants to analyse these reports and to see, actually, with all the talk of child rights, do states actually talk about child rights? Okay, do they talk about human rights? And I have to admit, I was a bit like, I'm going to nail them on this. Whoa, there'll be nothing. So it turns out there isn't nothing, right? And part of that is a reflection of the fact that human rights-based approach and concerns about human rights and development are